So the agenda today will be, we'll have a land acknowledgement. David will speak for around 45 minutes, and then we'll have our question and answer. And at the end, there can be any sharing of events or notices people might want to convey, and you can use the chat for that as well. Um, so I think that covers the sort of administrivia for a meeting like this. So let's begin our learning meeting by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous land that has been inhabited by Indigenous people from the beginning. As an elder demographic intent on learning more about the natural environment and our impact as humans on that environment, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet wherever we all live, and we thank all the generations of people who have taken care of these lands for thousands of years. Long before today, as we gather here online, there have been Indigenous peoples who have been the stewards of where we all live. In particular, as our presenter is in Toronto, we acknowledge that the land we are broadcasting from is in the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. As settlers, this sort of recognition of the contribution and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must also be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and in particular to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across our country. But I did want to say a couple things that, David obviously closely tracks Ontario's energy developments, and you've written quite extensively on climate policy and nuclear power. But you're also actively involved with SCAN and chair the Forward Bad Energy Choices Working Group. I think that's the title. So obviously, and I was going to say this earlier, but it's fairly obvious that we couldn't have had a better speaker to help us understand this issue and to guide us through the thinking of how we can effectively encourage the government to adopt a change in policy direction or change in government, probably more to the point.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks to Carl for the invitation to be here this morning. I'm going to do this presentation in a number of parts. I'm going to start with a Not in Ontario show and tell. And then I'm going to end with a suggestion that Ontario needs a climate plan. And in between those 2 points, I'm going to try and sketch out some of the dimensions about how energy politics has set the stage in Ontario. I'm going to talk a bit about the government's commitments to fossil gas, to Enbridge, the nuclear resolution that is happening in our province. And I'm going to suggest that that is all a wrong energy pathway and that we have to find an alternative path to the future. Let me start with the show and tell. This is a photo of a balcony solar array mounted on an apartment in Germany. This is a schematic that shows how simple it is to install. You go to the store, you bring it home, you plug it in. Balcony solar installations are rapidly growing in Germany. Other European countries, 2 states in America have permitted them, and 26 more are introducing legislation to promote balcony solar. But not in Ontario. The Ford government has no interest in permitting and promoting balcony solar or other behind-the-meter distributed energy developments. This is a photo of solar panels installed over, providing some shade for an agricultural crop. It's called agrivoltaics. Peas love it, so do sheep. Leafy green vegetables, field crops actually do well in agrivoltaic production. And those solar arrays are also effective at keeping moisture in the ground and protecting plants from too much sun. They have now developed solar panels that can be erected vertically in fields. They provide farmers with needed revenue, they power the grid, and they're compatible with agricultural production, but not in Ontario. Instead of promoting agrivoltaics, the Ford government has put up roadblocks. For instance, it announced a ban on ground-mounted solar panels, not only on prime agricultural land, but land used for specialty crops. So in the name of protecting agricultural land, the government has actually deprived farmers from the benefits of agrivoltaics. It's a hard photo to see, but it's a photograph of a window-sized heat pump in New York City housing. It's at the bottom of the screen. Here's what it looks like from the inside. So the New York City Housing Authority has recently completed a pilot project on the development and installation of apartment-sized heat pumps throughout its complexes. It used its massive purchasing power to go to some tech firms and say, design this for it, and we will buy it and use it. The result? Reduced energy use, more comfortable apartments. And now the New York Housing Authority is in an extensive rollout, and other housing authorities are looking at it as well. But not in Ontario. In fact, the Independent Electricity Systems Operator, IESO, that's the Crown agency responsible for planning and managing the Ontario electricity grid, just completed a 20-year energy plan for the City of Toronto. The plan actually sidelines and it downplays developments such as window heat pumps. This is a graphic representation of vehicle-to-grid integration. We all know that an electric vehicle draws power from the grid to charge its batteries. But when the car is idle, which is most of the time, actually research indicates 90% of the time, it can transmit power back to the grid. Vehicle-to-grid integration is underway in a number of European countries, and even the US Department of Energy has published a 10-year roadmap to get to vehicle-to-grid integration, and it calls it a critical tool in the toolbox. It provides a wide range of services such as peak shaving, load shifting, demand response, but not in Ontario. In fact, the ISO has argued that WGI is too much of a pilot project to be taken seriously in energy planning. It's really ironic because the biggest energy pilot project in Ontario is the small modular reactor at Darlington. And here we have the double standard. It rules out WGI, but it loves the small modular reactor. This is a map of the state of Texas. Texas is the fossil fuel capital of the US, but here's the surprise. Texas leads the US in wind generation and is second to California on solar. Solar accounts for about 8% of electricity. Wind is up around 13%, and the renewables are rapidly growing. In fact, this year, power plant developers are planning on over 11,000 megawatts of solar. That's the equivalent of the output of about 38 small modular reactors. But not in Ontario. Renewables aren't growing rapidly at all. You can see the energy output pie chart, and you can see, if you can find it, at the very top, that little yellow band that says solar, 1%. Wind is stalled at 8%. Not so long ago, Quebec Hydro just announced what it called the largest wind energy project in North America. It's going to put in place 10,000 megawatts of wind. but not in Ontario. You'll all remember this quote from Doug Ford. If I could tear up every wind turbine in this province, I would. This is a photo of the first twin tower solar thermal power plant in China. Now, the development of renewable energy in China is staggering in its scale, its pace, its extent. This is a pilot project. It's a wind turbine blimp in China that catches stronger winds at higher altitudes. More down to earth, the Chinese car maker BYD has launched a new generation of EV batteries. They're capable of 600-mile range, which breaks the threshold, which breaks the last barrier to EV adoption. It can be topped up for 250 miles in 5 minutes. And they're claiming that the battery is going to live longer than the car, but not in Ontario. Instead, just last week, Premier Ford asked British Columbia and asked Quebec to scrap their electric vehicle mandates. In Ontario, we get more fossil fuels. Back in Ontario, Ford, along with Danielle Smith, launched a feasibility study for an east-west fossil fuel pipeline. There was even talk at the time about a new deep water port on James Bay and a pipeline running from James Bay to southern Ontario through all of those Indigenous lands. This is an ad last week from the Toronto Star. Here's what it says. Our plan to protect Ontario is building new pipelines, courtesy Province of Ontario. And finally, here are two articles published a couple of days apart. The one on the left has this headline: Australians to get 3 hours of free electricity every day under a solar screen. The one on the right reads as follows: Ontario electricity supply costs jump 29% as nuclear spending rises. So Ontario is at an energy crossroads. Actually, the choice has already been made. The government is locking us into a high-cost nuclear and a high-emission fossil fuel strategy. Clean and cheap renewables, energy sources such as solar, wind, and storage have been shoved to the sidelines. Stephen Lecce became the Minister of Energy and Electrification, now Mines, in June 2024. Shortly afterwards, he traveled to the United States where he made a pitch to Western leaders and industry movers and shakers, and he told them that Ontario was building a blueprint for a nuclear energy future. A CP Wire story put it this way: Ontario is selling itself as the nuclear North Star to guide the direction of American power. I can't resist an aside. So he was speaking to a largely American audience, and he was referring to Russia and countries like that. And he says, quote, "It's time to rid our economies of any dependence on these foreign states that do not share our democratic values." Oops. So back at home, the minister moved quickly on three fronts. First, he made the rounds talking up Ontario's role as an energy superpower. Second, he used the term technology agnostic to roll back renewable energy. In fact, there was a major announcement by the IESO, a major procurement that was going to be built on wind and solar. Minister Lecce intervened to shift the focus. In August 24, he wrote a letter that said, "I expect the IESO to report back on an approach that is technology agnostic. And now, technology agnostic means more fossil fuels and more nuclear reactors. The third element was he weaponized the discussion of energy choices. Listen to this quote. He talks about a pro-growth agenda, but then he says, rather than the ideological dogma that offers false choices. And he criticized those who support renewable energy, basically. He criticized them who disagreed with the government's plans as ideologues who want to romanticize certain resources. It's alarming that the Minister of Energy is using energy choices in a culture war. So the political stage is set. The Ford government is proposing to build an additional 50,000 megawatts of power generation by 2050. And that is what is fueling the energy superpower dream. So we have the political stage. The government expresses its vision as being an energy superpower. I remind people there is a fine line between vision and hallucination. But after establishing that vision as an energy superpower, he then shifts the language. He talks about technology agnostic as a euphemism for gas and nuclear. And finally, those who disagree are denigrated and labeled as ideologues. He weaponizes the energy discussion. You can trace the development of the Ford government's energy policy through a series of documents that I've laid out on this screen for you. I think the two most consequential ones are the one on the far right of the screen, which is entitled Ontario's Affordable Energy Future. And now this one, which is the latest. This is the government's integrated energy plan, and it's entitled Energy for Generations. Catchy subtitle. Quote, Ontario's integrated energy plan to power the strongest economy in the G7. As a companion piece to these policy documents was a whole series of kind of Orwellian acts, or at least misnamed acts. We had Bill 165, officially called Keeping Energy Costs Down Act. That was really about protecting Enbridge profits in new housing developments. Then we had Bill 214, the Affordable Energy Act, which was giving legislative priority to nuclear reactors. And we had Bill 40, which was called Protect Ontario by Securing Affordable Energy for Generations Act. And what Bill 40 does, it codifies economic growth as a priority for electricity regulation and procurement. It shifts more grid costs to the taxpayers. And finally, it promotes a fossil gas hydrogen market. So let's look at some of the players in a little bit of detail. First, with the Enbridge-Ford alliance. Most of Ontario's energy use is oil and gas. In fact, as this table shows, 79% is oil and gas. And in fact, it would be even higher if we included gas-fired electricity plants. Enbridge is responsible for bringing most of this oil and gas into Ontario. That's how it makes its money. Enbridge is a huge oil and gas multinational, 53 billion in revenue, 5 billion in profits, nominally Canadian, but its CEO, Greg Elby, lives in Texas, and Greg used to work for the Stephen Harper government. The scale of this map is small, but let me summarize basically what it says. The yellow and the blue are oil pipelines and gas pipelines. But here's what we know. 28,000 plus kilometers of crude pipeline, 120,000 kilometers of gas transmission lines, 85,000 kilometers of service lines. And every day, all of those kilometers of pipeline are full of climate-wrecking crude and fossil gas or methane. In fact, methane or fossil gas is used to heat Ontario homes. It's used to generate our electricity, and it is used as an industrial fuel or feedstock. And all of those uses create toxic emissions like nitrogen dioxides, and it creates climate pollution in the form of greenhouse gases. Around 70% of our fossil gas comes from America, and most of it comes from the fracking fields of northeastern United States. And here's the problem. The more reliant we are on that imported fuel, the more money we send out of the country. And while sovereignty and energy independence have become kind of code words in Canada for both the federal and the Ontario government, the fact is we import that amount of our energy and we send the money out of the country. This slide comes from a presentation to Enbridge shareholders. Enbridge describes its business as, lower right-hand side, a low-risk business, left side, a predictable cash flow growth, and the top guaranteeing a strong total return. It's a money-making machine. But the renewable energy transition has the potential to actually upend that business model. It can replace a predictable cash flow with stranded assets, all of those pipelines sitting idle. And it can turn a low-risk business into a high-risk one pretty quickly. So in response, Enbridge has developed a strategy to make sure that doesn't happen. It has to keep and expand its customer base. It is greenwashing methane. It has to mount a counteroffensive, and it has to get the Ford government on side to support its plans. And Enbridge has been remarkably successful. This slide shows a quick tally of the many ways the Ford government has acted on behalf of Enbridge. I'm going to focus only on the highlighted ones, and that very briefly. Let's start with Bill 165. So the Ontario Energy Board a while back decided to end the practice where developers got free gas pipelines in their new subdivisions, and the new homeowners were forced to pay for it over 40 years. The Ontario Energy Board said gas shouldn't be given a priority over, for instance, heat pumps. Let's level the playing field. Well, the Ontario government just went ballistic. It sided with Enbridge, it whacked the Ontario Energy Board, and Enbridge got billions. The Ontario government also supports Enbridge through its gas expansion program. That's a program that subsidizes the building of Enbridge pipelines in areas not currently controlled by Enbridge. And it is paid for by the new customers not only paying for their gas, but a special surcharge for the hookup. And it is paid for by everyone else in Ontario, if you're a gas consumer, paying a small monthly compulsory fee. So far, the Ontario government has given Enbridge $281 million in this program alone. That same amount of money could have been used to buy every one of Enbridge's new customers a heat pump. The Ford government is also promoting more gas plants. In 2013, gas-fired electricity accounted for 4% of our electricity. By 2023, that had tripled to 13%. According to the Ford planning documents, it's going to increase again to 18% by 2030 and 27% in 2040. We are building a dirty electrical grid at the same time that the world is trying to get to a clean electrical grid. And along with those new gas plants comes more gas plant pollution, more greenhouse gases. they're expected to rise by about 300% between now and 2040. Last point on gas. The government promised that it was going to develop a major integrated energy plan, and it did, and it released it, and it called it Energy for Generations. Chapter 5 of the plan is what the Ontario government calls its new gas policy. So we know that there is clear scientific consensus now that we have to rapidly shift away from fossil fuels. There is also a political consensus, and I know it's fragile, but there is a political consensus that says we need to phase out oil, gas, and coal. That was actually the breakthrough at COP28 a few years back. The Ford government is going in the opposite direction. Here's what the new gas policy says. Natural gas is a critical energy source for Ontario. Natural gas is also critical to supporting electrification. There is a need for an economically viable national natural gas network. Listen, to drive economic growth, to maintain customer choice. Ford has made a long-term commitment to Enbridge Gas. And Ontario's gas policy has actually shifted quite dramatically over the last few years. It used to be that we were told we needed gas plants to help phase out coal. Then we were told that we needed new gas plants while nuclear plants were being refurbished. Now, natural gas is a long-term economic commitment. We were told, and everyone agreed, that you had to decarbonize the economy by phasing out gas plants. The argument was always, when would it happen? Now that argument has changed. Now the government is offering up this weird concept called beneficial electrification. So now it says you can justify more gas-powered electricity despite the increase in emissions if elsewhere in the economy there's some reduced emissions as a result. The point is we do not need to make those trade-offs. Less than 10 years ago, the nuclear industry was over. No nuclear reactors had been built in decades. Most of the reactors were reaching their best before dates, and the collapse of Ontario Hydro was still a cautionary tale. Now, the Ford government is committed to the largest expansion of nuclear power in Canada's history. And I offer a corollary. The nuclear industry is pulling off one of the greatest cons in business history. This chart shows our electricity generation by fuel type. As you can see, nuclear, which is that kind of orange-brown, is at about 53%. Solar and wind don't amount to much at all. This table comes from the government's new integrated energy plan. It shows the projected increase in electricity from nuclear reactors up to 2050. That's the green bar that you see. The light orange shade shows the declining role of solar and wind in our electricity mix. Now, recall that Canada signed on to the international goal of tripling renewables by 2030. Once again, not in Ontario. In fact, by 2050, nuclear will probably account for 75% of our electricity. According to the International Energy Agency, on a world basis, it will be less than 10%. In December 2024, the government passed the misnamed Affordable Energy Act. I bring it to your attention because of this clause in the Act. Section 25 refers to, quote, the prioritization of nuclear power generation to meet future increases in the demand for electricity. This is a troubling first. A particular energy choice, a particular energy technology is now given preferential treatment in legislation. Energy for Generations continues it when it says, clean, affordable, and reliable nuclear power will continue to serve as, quote, the backbone of the province's electricity system. Now, if there are three things nuclear isn't, it is clean, affordable, and reliable. The nuclear expansion in Ontario is occurring through refurbishment of old reactors and the building of new reactors. This chart shows the refurbishment schedule. You can see, I won't go into detail, it's quite extensive. It extends out to at least 2034. And the price of this refurbishment is what we're now starting to pay for in our electricity bills. The refurbishments, keep in mind, are happening because the plants didn't last as long as they were supposed to. They were done before their best before dates. So there are two types, that's refurbishment, shift to new builds. There are two types of new builds being considered. One is pictured on this slide, and that is the small modular reactors. The other I'll get to in a minute is the large scale. The small modular reactor at Darlington has never been built anywhere. The design belongs to GE Vernova Hitachi Nuclear Energy, which is headquartered in the United States. It's called the BWRX 300, which refers to boiling water reactor, and 300 refers to the output. This is the first time in our history that we will use a foreign design for a nuclear reactor. It's also the first time in our history that we will fuel the reactor with enriched uranium. And that enriched uranium will come from the United States. Now, the main reason SMRs have not been built is because no one wants to pay for them. No private sector developer, no investors want to put their money into small modular reactors. That is where Ontario Power Generation comes in. Ontario Power Generation is a Crown corporation. Its role, as it sees it, is to underwrite the cost of small modular reactors. In fact, Kim Lauriston, who was a senior OPG, a senior vice president at OPG, told a business audience that they were prepared to take the first risk. She went on to say that because small modular reactors take too long to build, that industry needs to see them. You have to give investors the confidence. You have to get the ball rolling. So, because investors are nervous, because private sector won't put up its money, Ontario wants to build the reactor and have it paid for by Ontario taxpayers and ratepayers. And the cost of that reactor is considerable. OPG has just announced that it will cost $7.7 billion for the first one. Now, $1.1 billion of that is shared costs. But $7.7 billion for 300 megawatts is outrageous. And now we pay for it in three different ways. In fact, Carney, came to Darlington, announced he was putting up $2 billion of our federal taxes to it, and he called it a nation-building project. We pay for it with $1 billion through our Ontario taxes, and the rest of it will pay for in increased electricity rates. This is an incredibly expensive way to boil water. In fact, here's a comparison. Manitoba is proposing to spend $3 billion on a fuel combustion plant capable of generating 750 megawatts of electricity. We don't want fossil fuel plants, but I give you this to show less than half the amount of money, more than twice the electricity output. Why would you choose small modular reactors? In fact, a number of years ago, GE Hitachi executive said that in order to make this commercially viable, the reactor would have to come in at about $1 billion. We're at 7.7 billion for the first one. We'll be at 21 billion plus for all four, nowhere near $1 billion a reactor. There are two sites for large-scale nuclear reactors in Ontario. One is Bruce C. Here they're talking about 4 or 5 new reactors, up to 4,800 megawatts. These will be the first large-scale reactors in over 3 decades, if they get approval to be built. They're under the impact assessment review process, and there is no guarantee that the technology will be Canadian designed. More recently, the Ford government announced the largest, most expensive nuclear complex to be built in the world, what they call new nuclear at Wesleyville in Port Hope. 8 to 10 large-scale reactors, 10,000 megawatts of electricity, the largest anywhere. The technology isn't chosen yet, but 3 of the 4 possible nuclear designs that they're looking at are foreign-owned. And each of them has a legacy of problems. And each of those 3 require imported enriched uranium. The 4th one is the CANDU Monarch, and it has its own problems. It used to be a Crown corporation. It's now owned by Atkins-Realis. And folks, if you remember, Atkins-Realis is the new image polishing name for scandal-plagued SNC-Lavalin. The project is in the early days. There's a federal impact assessment going on. OPG has initiated what they call their initial project description. And in that project description, they made this outrageous statement. No alternatives to the project are being considered. The world is involved in an energy transition in the electrical sector. We're seeing solar, wind, and storage go great guns all across the world. And here we have a government that says 8 to 10 nuclear plants and no alternatives to the project are being considered. I've tried to provide an estimate of some of these costs. In yellow is what I've estimated the cost of the new nuclear at Wesleyville to be. My estimate, very conservative, is $160 billion. Other people peg it at $230 billion. But if we add it all up, the refurbishments, the Darlington, the Bruce, the Port Hope, the deep geological waste, and on, we get to a price tag of between $336 billion and $423 billion. In December, the Ontario government changed regulations governing how to price and cost energy. In fact, for the first time now, we've got the Ontario Power Generation has applied to the OEB for a 72.6% increase in the price it has paid for nuclear power. 72%. OPG, because the regulation changed, is now able to start charging for the costs of Pickering and Darlington before they're even completed. We are being charged for electricity years before it is generated. Another Ford first. Expensive nuclear is going to drive up our electricity bills. We know it makes electricity very expensive. We know it crowds out investments in renewable energy. We know it poses a risk for stranded assets, and it imposes a huge public debt on families. If you're like me, the notion of $1 billion is just, beyond your frame of reference. So here's a quick comparison. We could provide every dwelling in Ontario with a free 20,000 heat pump for $110 billion. We could also then add on a free 20,000 rooftop solar system for another 110 billion. Both of those initiatives could be accomplished at half the cost of the new nuclear plan. There's a lot of worrying developments here. The Ford government's commitment to fossil gas has clearly firmed up over the last couple of years. We're going to have more emissions for a long time. Nuclear has now become the baseload touchstone of electrification despite its costs. Those who oppose it are just branded as ideologues. They have weaponized the energy conversation. And I think this is really important. The integral link between energy and climate has been severed. When the Ford government talks about energy, it does not talk about climate. Instead, here's what it says. Energy will be the cornerstone of the province's economic strategy and success. All over the world, people are linking energy and climate crisis. They are moving off fossil fuels with renewable energy because energy and climate are integrally linked. What we get in Ontario is Bill 40, which codifies economic growth as the priority for the Ontario Energy Board and the IESO. Not cheap electricity, not sustainable electricity, not efforts to address the climate crisis, but economic growth as the priority. When Ford was first elected in 2018, he promised to reduce electricity rates by 12%. He also promised that his new Made in Ontario climate plan would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2030. Didn't happen, won't happen. Instead, what has happened is that Ontario's energy policy has been captured by Enbridge Gas and the nuclear industry, and the Ford government has championed. It has actually led that development. As a result, renewable energy is being squeezed out. This is a chart from the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. What you see in it is a comparative costs of wind, solar, and new nuclear and gas-fired. The blue and yellow in the middle, that's wind and solar. The brown and gray at the far right, that's fossil fuels and nuclear. When the OB increased electricity charges by 29%, Ford responded by increasing the electricity subsidy. Because our electricity is so expensive, Ford uses tax revenues to help cushion the blow, to subsidize the cost. The Office of Financial Accountability has actually said this is a really worrying development in financial terms. There are 9 subsidy programs. Some are for industry, some for farmers, some for residential customers. But here's what the Office of the Financial Accountability Office says. On an annual basis, and that's before the recent increase, the subsidies cost taxpayers $7 billion a year. Over a 20-year period, they say it will cost $118 billion. That's $118 billion we're not putting into healthcare. That's $118 billion we're not putting into education because we're subsidizing high-priced electricity. Ontario is locked into a future of fossil fuels and nuclear. And we know what that means. We know we're going to get higher bills, more pollution. We're going to have rising greenhouse gas emissions. We have greater health risks. We get more dependence on the United States. We have a risk of stranded assets. We actually risk another energy bankruptcy in Ontario, and we will have more severe weather and climate breakdown. And we know that the path not taken is a path that could have low cost and low emission energy through renewables, in which we could get lower electricity bills, greater energy independence, reduced energy poverty, more good local jobs, and greater energy innovation. So technically, we know how to get there. We know how to get onto the renewable energy transition pathway. I won't go through this list, but we know technically how to do it. The question for us really is this: politically speaking, how do we get there? I'll come back to that question in a minute or two. In late November, the Ford government passed Bill 68. It's called a Plan to Protect Ontario Act. It's a budget bill. It was 200 pages. And in those 200 pages was hidden this Schedule 1. Well, not hidden, was this Schedule 1. What Schedule 1 did was hit the delete key on Ontario's climate plan. In the budget bill, they got rid of the climate plan. So now Ontario is a climate outlier. We have no climate goals. We have no emission reduction targets. We have no timelines. We have no obligations to report to the public. Now, there can be speculation as to why Ford canceled Ontario's climate plan that he used to brag about. I think part of the explanation is because he was tired of being exposed by the Ontario auditor. In October, she released her third damning report on the failure of the Ontario government to address climate crisis. Another explanation was to derail the eco-justice legal challenge. Recall, it was just days away from getting to court, and the focus of the case was the Ontario climate plan. So they pulled the plan. Eco-justice is now rethinking about how to approach the issue. But maybe he just finally got emboldened by Trump's climate denial and Carney's climate retreat. But for whatever reasons, we are now in a situation that for the first time in almost 2 decades, there are no legislative requirements in Ontario to help address the climate breakdown. Despite the growing dangers we face from fires and floods, from droughts and heat, Ontario has scrapped its climate targets. When Ford was first elected, Ontario was within reach of meeting its climate goals. But in the Ford years, we've gone from being a climate leader to being a climate laggard. And now, in just a few lines of legislative text, we have become a climate outlier. We join Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Trump's America. So politically speaking, how do we do it? How do we get there? Well, we know we need a change in government. And we know that's 3 years or whatever away. More immediately, we need to build to that event. And we need to build that by building more broad-based advocacy campaigns. And I think a focus of one of those advocacy campaigns can be the simple fact that Ontario needs a climate plan. If we organize a campaign on Ontario needs a climate plan, the goal is quite clear and quite broad and speaks to most Ontario. Ontario needs a climate plan. The strategy would be to build a critical mass of people to speak out about that need. And critical mass here means not just volume, but diverse voices, different stories, different groups talking about the need for a climate plan, from school children to academics, from faith groups to community groups. We need a climate plan. And the tactics, they could be as kind of focused as our resolve or as broad as our imagination. But I do know that when we talk about Ontario needs a climate plan, we have to shift a bit. I don't think we can talk anymore about mitigation and adaptation and the technical language of emission reductions and greenhouse gases and emission caps and whatever. I think that we have to shift to a language of protection, to protect the things that we love and the places we love and the people we love from climate breakdown, that we have to try to prevent. We have to try to prevent more severe weather, more catastrophic loss. And we have to focus on affordability. And this is where energy and climate plans come together, because there is a strategy to make energy more affordable, and it is also the strategy to deal with the climate crisis. I'm going to end with 2 somewhat good points of good news. This is a poll, a very recent poll that reports about the popularity of provincial premiers. Second from the bottom, if you can see it, is Doug Ford. What it says is that 63% of Ontarians strongly or moderately disapprove of him. 63%. Only 31% approve of him. How do we build on that? I think that this notion of progressive activists is a starting point for us. Eco-analytics, a research polling institution, has come up with what they call 5 Canada audience segments on climate action. It's based on polling, focus groups, other research. But what they have identified is a range of groups from progressive activists on one side to fossil fuel conservatives on the other side. In Ontario, they say there are 16% of the population is progressive activists. When I did the math, then that came out to 2.2 million adults are progressive activists. 480,000 seniors are in that progressive activist grouping. And who are these people? Well, according to eco-analysts, they are informed about the climate, but they're not necessarily active on it. Over half of them would join a campaign when they were asked. About 1 in 5 say they're already involved in one sort of campaign or another. 1 out of 3 of them actually speak to their family and friends about climate. This is a group that is ready to be mobilized. Over 2 million Canadians, close to 500,000 seniors. The question is, how do we mobilize them? And I'll leave that for discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, David. That's comprehensive and really appreciate it. Just unmute yourself and go for it.
Yeah, very good, David. There's another cost, and I was wondering if you had any figures on what it will take to expropriate the land and for rights of way for transmission lines to get power out of the any generator or generating station that is built. How do we get that to the rest of the grid? Well, we're going to need tower lines, and that's going to have probably a cost of maybe more billions. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a couple of things. That there is always the question about how do you get electricity or energy from where it's produced to where it's consumed. It also, I mean, that is particularly a problem when you have mega project kind of developments like nuclear power plants that are all located in one location, and then you have to build all sorts of transmission grids to get them to the cities or the towns where the energy is used. In a much more distributed energy initiative, that is small scale and grid scale solar and wind on a community basis, a lot of those huge transmission costs are avoided. That is what, Quebec Hydro has just talked about with its 10,000 megawatts of wind power, because it says those transmission grids are already in the rural settings in which the wind will be. So there's a natural fit up there. And secondly, we've just got the announcement in Toronto, for those in Toronto, that they are going to build a $1.5 billion underwater cable to bring energy from the nuclear plants at Pickering and Darlington into the city of Toronto. That transmission line, I won't say it won't be necessary because I can't say what's going to be 15 years from now. But I would have said, let's hold off on building that transmission line and the money that's associated with it until we do a better job of renewable energy in the city. Uh, and that means kind of what I've shown on the screen, the apartment heat pumps, the balcony solar, the rooftop solar, the parking lot solar, wind turbines out in the middle of Lake Ontario, energy efficiency initiatives, vehicle to grid integration. Let's go through that technical list, which is economic, before we get to high price transmission lines.
Hey, Terry?
Hi, thanks, David, for that presentation. I think it was, I mean, I think that every time we go through the economics of nuclear, and the politics of gas, I just get more outraged. But I'll try to contain it for a minute. What I'm thinking about is the labor movement, and what I've been thinking about in terms of the 2.2 million folks that you identified as being, I guess, open to climate activism, and the 480,000 seniors. My question would be, how many of those folks are actually in labor, inside the labor movement, inside a trade union, and including how many of the retirees would be retirees from trade unions, and what your thinking is about the capacity to actually counteract what's been going on with the debates, for example, inside the NDP that have been led by construction unions and the power workers, with trying to change NDP policy with respect to making it like removing pro-nuclear barriers from NDP policy. What's your sense of the labor movement and the capacity for the climate movement to mobilize people inside the labor movement to be more active in terms of turning around Ontario's energy policy?
Yeah, it's we're almost like two solitudes at the moment. The climate action groups and movement, and the labor movement, and bridges need to be built, and they have to be built effectively. And we know that there's always a stumbling block when it comes to jobs. uh, that in Ontario, it's the power workers and the construction workers saying, we need nuclear power because it provides us with good jobs. Well, the good jobs in nuclear power is largely around construction, and any development, any development creates construction jobs. So it's not exclusive to nuclear. It's just where the government is saying it's putting its money. If the government said we are going to build 50,000 megawatts of wind power, there would be more jobs than are created in the nuclear construction. Once the operations are in place, though, like a nuclear plant, it doesn't take many people to run them. I saw a figure, I don't know that I can source it, but that when the small modular reactor is up and running at Darlington, it will take like 75 people to run it. Uh, so there are good jobs to be had. In fact, there are more jobs in the renewable energy sector around the world than there are in nuclear. It far outstrips nuclear. But in Ontario, we've got this government committed to a strategy that is supported by those unions who see it in terms of jobs. Uh, in terms of the NDP, I mean, it was an interesting debate that the pro-nuclear organizations were quite successful, but where the policy ended up was around supporting, interestingly enough, Canadian nuclear. And that's going to be one of the tests here, because we don't have Canadian nuclear. That small modular reactor at Darlington is not Canadian nuclear. 3 out of the 4 designs at Wesleyville are not Canadian nuclear. So the shift in policy may be less dramatic than what it seems. But I think that we have to find ways to talk. And I think there are many organizations in the labor movement that we can talk to. For instance, all of those involved in healthcare know that they are starved for funding. And all of the healthcare unions know that our healthcare system is being dismantled. And when you see a nuclear price tag of 400 billion plus, and you think about what you could do in healthcare for that money, then I think that changes the conversation. I think it's true for public sector workers. I think it's true for transit workers who think that electrified transit will give them a boost in jobs. So I think that there are ways to talk to the labor movement about the jobs involved, but not only the jobs, but the social services and the health and protection of our communities. It's not easy. I wouldn't want to, well, yeah, I was going to say, I wouldn't want to sit down and get a debate with the power workers union representatives, but actually I would. I would like to talk to them about how they come to grips with the costs, because I am actually afraid that these costs are going to bankrupt the Ontario Power Generation. Look what it just did last week. It sold a renewable energy operation it had in the United States for a loss of $471 million. It took the loss because it had to quickly find money for the nuclear program. That fiscal irresponsibility is already coming home to roost. And when you're thinking that you are going to spend $400 billion between now and 2048, and you think you have a way for paying for that? Sorry, that was a rhetorical ending.
Great. Thanks, David. David, I know you had some questions in the chat as well,
Yeah,
so
so
go
I've
for
got
it.
100 questions. Thanks so much for this really enlightening and incisive presentation. Thinking of the 80% of people who don't connect to climate and don't see themselves as active, but for many people, climate is an abstraction. CO2 emissions are abstractions, but people do get health and they get food. And of course, these are all intimately related, particularly keeping the green belt healthy, and which can be, I think it's related to energy very closely. If we could subsidize farmers to switch to regenerative agriculture and not soybeans for cattle farming somewhere else. So, local food for local consumption, local energy for local consumption, all the arguments around costs, and of course the total hypocrisy of this widely acknowledged corruption in this government. I don't think that's even disputed, not even by the government. So anyway, just your thoughts about the relationship.
Okay, that was a lot. Yes, judging by the recent move on FOI, clearly the government knows about its own corruption of stopping the FOI. You made a number of important points. One is around, how we rethink things like food and health. It's amazing the amount of acreage in Ontario we devote to producing ethanol. A complete waste of agricultural land. Ethanol is one of the most inefficient energy sources you could ever imagine. You hold up a glass panel to the sun and you get energy. You then have to grow a crop, use all the fertilizer, all the fossil fuel inputs to grow corn, and it has what, a 23% or a 13% conversion value to energy. It's just ridiculous. That it's how people connect to climate, because you said, what about the other 80%? Well, I think if we can more effectively get to that 20% that are considered progressive activists, we know they talk to their family and friends. So, that's a road to that other 80%, family and friends. Another is, and I don't want this to sound like, oh, bad news is good news, but we are at a very calamitous point at the moment because we're entering a new cycle of El Nino. This is the first time in history that it has come so rapidly on the heels of a previous El Nino of less than 3 years ago. This El Nino is starting at the highest temperature level that an El Nino has ever happened at, 1.4 degrees, and coming out of La Nina. This El Nino is going to hit it's now, you already see it hitting in the American West, but it is going to be a summer of climate calamity. And I think that as people feel the heat stress, as people suffer the severe weather storms, as people feel all of that, the connection between what we are doing and the climate is going to become more and more apparent. And I don't want to say that it takes people facing hardship to convince them otherwise. What I am saying is as the climate gets worse, as we go into a very dangerous summer, if we are prepared to talk to people about the connections between their health, their security, and their well-being, and what's going on with the burning of fossil fuels, I think there will be an openness to listen and an openness to act.
Thanks, David. Roberta.
Hi. Fantastic talk. Thank you. You got me upset. I would just like to suggest that one group that we might want to be reaching are, in fact, the Green Party, the Liberals, and the NDP. Talk to them about working together. They have almost identical concerns and policies. The Conservatives only got 43% of the vote. Right now, in this interim period, could they not hold press conferences together speaking against the problems? You know, not just Greens over here, Liberals together. And then maybe they could start thinking about let's work together and change our voting system. So I know that's very abstract for a lot of people, but it might be a high leverage thing for those that are interested in that kind of stuff.
That's a good strategy point to keep in mind, Roberta. Thanks. David?
Yeah, a
Oh,
quick response.
yeah, sure.
Oh, sorry, not me. I'll stop. Yeah, I won't
No,
respond
no,
to
go ahead.
everyone. I don't want to take the time. Other people,
Oh,
go to
okay.
Dave.
Dave Goldman.
Thank you, Michael, and David, well done. Your question about how to mobilize, I don't think has been answered yet or addressed, really. You say we have 480,000 progressive activists who are seniors. I've maintained that for a number of years that we aren't really reaching them. We aren't really getting to them. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. I was interested in David Suzuki's comment on his 90th birthday that we should be locally organizing communities in order to address forthcoming issues that need to be worked on and that governments won't be able to cover. Every organization, we'll talk about CALL, has a large number of members who are very supportive but don't know what the hell to do. And my suggestion is, with CALL and with SCAN and with others, that you set them up on almost a quasi-military basis, ask them to join Troop A, which is going to be calling Premier, whatever his name is, Ford on his telephone on a daily basis and so forth, and calling Green parties and calling Liberal parties and so forth. Whatever the brain trust decides will be the tactic at that time, and that there be 480,000 people mobilized in troops that will follow a plan to be devised by the brain trust. We have to reach out to those people and ask them if they're prepared to work on some kind of program which will be talked about, developed, and you have active involvement on an ongoing basis. Have them sign up. That's my suggestion that I've made for several years.
So can I comment? The two last speakers are saying something different, but also similar, and I just want to speak to that. Roberta talked about finding ways for the parties to work together. Unfortunately, that working cooperatively with other parties is just totally against the DNA of political parties. But if we can find ways that doesn't force them but encourage them to work together, for instance, that's why I think something like a campaign around Ontario needs a climate plan can get them working together. Because I don't know that we're going to convince Ford to bring in a climate plan. And unfortunately, if we did, it would be a bad one. So our best hope is building for a future government. And that means all three parties speaking to the need for a climate plan, and all three parties talking about what would be in that climate plan. And that is both the basis of competition, but it's also the basis of cooperation. And I think that's why we have to provide a leadership role around the notion of a climate plan. Dave was talking about, the tactics and strategies. It was, how do we organize for action? And I think, again, we need a campaign. We need a campaign that says we are going to spend the next 2 years getting as many people in Ontario on board and supporting the need for a climate plan. And we're going to move concern to action. We're going to take people from being concerned about the climate to acting on the climate. And I think, Dave, you talked about a number of ways we can do that. The tactics are there's hundreds and hundreds of tactics we can engage in. But if we have a common focus, Ontario needs a climate plan that protects what we love, that prevents more breakdown, that makes energy affordable. I think we can organize around that.
I think that's a really good segue for us to be able to talk a little bit before we close this meeting about what we can do together. But let's get to Liz.
Yeah, hi. That was a very good summary of many of the things that I've already heard elsewhere, but it was very succinct. So thank you for that. What occurs to me is that what you're saying about the government and many people characterizing a lot of activist groups, including SCAN, including CAL, including Climate Fast, OCEC, Seniors for Climate, they just identify them as radical leftists and dismiss them. So I think that one of the more important things would be to find someone who, more trusted messengers, someone perhaps from the corporate community. I'm thinking of people who we could be put in touch with through what do you call it? Corporate nights, people like that. And see if they cannot talk some sense into the government, into people, into voters, because they wouldn't have the reputation of bringing in a lot of other agenda items that I think a lot of people have rejected.
So finding a variety of spokespersons, I think, is important. That we work at times pretty closely with Corporate Knights and Ralph Torrey. We do that already. That we have just set up a kind of coalition of groups around trying to build pressure and resistance to the new Wesleyville nuclear plants, and people like Ralph Torrey from Corporate Knights is part of that. So we do have those links. But it's also, I think, that part of the problem, I think, is that we have been talking, maybe we haven't been telling our stories in the right way. Maybe our evidence is too technical. And I'm a researcher, I'm a policy guy, and so I'm very that's what I want. But I also realize that people are motivated by stories, they're motivated by a narrative, they're influenced by friends and family. And if we can find ways to talk about the climate in ways that I've mentioned here, the notion of protection, the notion of prevention, the notion of affordability, I think then that it's the message that will carry it. And I don't think that the messenger becomes as important. If we have a message that resonates, and it is a message that people hear from a variety of different places, in a variety of different voices, school children, professors, doctors, housing advocates, health advocates, if we can get people talking together about protect, prevent, affordability, then I think that we accomplish the goal.
I think affordability is the one that has to really be focused on, because that's what people really care about, is dollars and cents, and they need someone they can trust, that they believe in.
I wanted to share this book too, Made to Stick. It gives you like succinct things about if you're going to do a campaign, how do you make it stick? How do you make the message stick? So yeah, I'm going to try and use that as I prepare some sandwich boards for my front walkway here, to get people to just think about things, and hopefully it'll stick.
I think this is an opportunity to try to talk a bit more about the idea of a focused campaign. It seems to me that the idea of raising the fact that Ontario doesn't have a climate plan and forcing the government to create a climate plan and pointing out to people what a plan like that needs to include, which would be those, the focus that you're identifying, Dave. Um, I think I think that's really what allows us to try to mobilize other groups uh, to join forces, because we need that kind of central theme. That there's a lot of interests that people have in various organizations that are engaged in any social justice work, and when people can see a very clear objective for a campaign, it's much easier to try to pull us all together so that we can work together on a common campaign. So I for one think it's a good approach. And I'm curious about whether people think David's idea and the approach of developing a campaign makes sense. Or are there other things that people would identify as a campaign? I think it leads to what Dave Goldman was saying, is that if you have that focus, then you have something very concrete to develop tactics around, for one thing, but also to invite other people in to sign on to that campaign and to actually do something. And that's where the tactics come in. There can be a range of things that people can do. And I want to take a couple minutes at the end to talk about the March 27th strategy that SCAN has, because that strategy has tactics that allow people to enter into the engagement for March 27th at different levels. You can sign a letter. You can come out to an MP's office. You can get engaged in individual activities that are occurring in different communities. So I think that's what you always need in a campaign, is a range of tactics for those uh, for people to enter into engagement at a level that they're capable of doing. So what do people think about this idea of you know the climate plan? Ontario needs a climate plan as a mechanism for organizing around. Any comments? Uh, Terry, Dave's got thumbs up. Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a campaign like this is absolutely essential. I mean, it's astonishing how far we've come. From Ford and Company developing a Made in Ontario environment plan and trying to um, tie itself to the whole progress that was made around getting rid of coal-fired electrical generation and riding on the coattails of previous governments that made those kinds of decisions, and then basically claiming time and time again that they were on track to meet Ontario's climate targets, and then just ditching the entire plan completely and just reversing course. I mean, I think that this is, I mean, at the time when the crisis is getting worse, what do we have? We have politicians running away as fast as they possibly can from taking the action that we need. So, I mean, I think that this is both an existential necessity for us to demand action from the people who are supposed to have our backs, and to mobilize people. Because you look at a campaign for Ontario needing a climate plan is going to require the people who are engaged in that plan to talk to a whole bunch of people that we don't talk to right now. Because if we're going to succeed in doing this, we're going to have to get out there in the community and be talking to people like we haven't talked to them before about all the reasons why, all the everything from the kinds of consequences from extreme weather, to all the other consequences that we're going to be facing. And and I think that David's right, we're going to be experiencing all sorts of things that are going to making that point easier, because the consequences of climate disruption are coming home to roost in so many ways. So I think it's both an existential need, but also I think it provides a framework to pull together a whole bunch of people who are unhappy with what Ford has been doing, and gives us an opportunity to organize and pull in the same direction. So I like it. I think it's got good strategic and tactical possibilities associated with it. The question is whether or not we can get elements of what we would call the climate movement pulling in the same direction on this. And I think that would be the next stage, is to talk with all our fellow and sister organizations to see whether or not this works for them and that they're prepared to join such a campaign.
Great. Thanks, Terry. Liz?
Yeah, I'm not sure that developing a climate plan is going to motivate a lot of voters. I'm not convinced, because I think that the average voter is motivated by kitchen table issues, money, affordability, healthcare, things like that. And I'm not sure, Ford is losing support, but I don't know that it's because of his not having a climate plan. He's losing support because unemployment is high, because our healthcare is in shambles, because of all the things that he's doing to waste money. And I still think that we have a very strong argument against their energy plan, based on the fact that it is going to hugely impact the cost of energy. When the Wynne government fell to Ford, that was sort of the beginning of the end. That was because of cost. It was because of the gas plants and all of that. So I think that's really the hook, to get everybody really motivated to reveal, to expose what they're doing.
Dave?
Right. I have no military background. I've got a lot of background in teams, and really enjoyed it. When you're working with a team, it's what's your task today? If you played rugby and played it socially, your task would be to outsing the other team after a match where you applauded them off the field. That was the major task that day. But let me use a military image. Let us say we form, how many did you say, David? 480,000 senior activists? Let us say half of them would be interested in joining a team. And let's call the team a regiment. And a regiment typically has 1,000 to 3,000 people in it. So I don't know the math on that, but if you had 200,000 people in regiments, each regiment could have a different plan of action coordinated by our brain trust, and we would hammer them on an ongoing basis. We don't have that happening now. Our political parties are political parties. We are looking at this whole question of energy and climate and whatever. So that's my suggestion, that you canvass your members who are inactive and say, come join a regiment. Call it I don't care, the call regiment on beautification, whatever, call it. But we have to organize. We have to get these people to sign up.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Judy?
Thank you for a very wonderful talk. This is encouraging because it's talking about action. And I was doing my taxes yesterday and claiming my Elections Ontario income that I recognize they don't give you a T4 under $500. So there are probably tens of thousands of people out there not paying taxes. Another little giveaway that Doug Ford has done is employed all those people in February and given them a free pass on having to pay tax on that by not giving them a T4. Anyway, at that election of elector or voters really shone through when a person looked at their ballot and says, I don't see Rob Ford's name. Okay, well, I had to tell them he's dead. They went Doug Ford's name. You know, like, so the ignorance of who votes is one thing to address. The lack of voter mobilization is another we need to address, because it's one thing to say in 3 years we got to change this government, but if in that 3 years we also don't make a focus on somehow getting people agitated enough to know they have a voice, they have a way to change things, and it's through the voting process, we're not going to see anything different than what we saw in February with a poor turnout at the polls and a majority government formed by a minority of people actually voting. And I'll even pare that down to a minority of educated, intelligent people voting. So again, I'd like to address voter mobilization somehow as part of this campaign.
Absolutely.
And I think I really like that comment that although climate plan is huge and we need it, right now it doesn't resonate. Sadly, because of the cost of gas in your car, the cost of food on your table, affordability is the critical thing that we need to address. But how we do it, and then if it underlines that by addressing affordability, oh my gosh, we're also addressing climate, right? Showing people how much nuclear and gas plant electricity production is going to cost them not only in the short term, but in the long term to their generations that follow is probably something that could start to resonate and make them start thinking that if there's a cheaper alternative that has been not even considered under policy, and cost comparison. People do cost comparison in the grocery aisles. If they see cost comparison of nuclear gas, wind, solar storage, and they start seeing, crap, why are we paying? And get it down to like, you've got $400 billion. How much is that per taxpayer? Put that price tag on their radar so they see how much they individually are paying for this right now. And these are like estimates before cost overruns. And we all know the history of nuclear builds. I mean, we're talking about projections to 20. They may not even be finished building by the time that those, like when you start thinking about how long they take and how much overrun they take, start putting those kinds of facts out there so people realize you're not just paying now, it's going to jump later when the real costs start coming in. And it's, probably when you're going to be able to least afford it. So again, just recognizing that there's messages that'll probably resonate and may get people angry enough to get out there and vote.
Thanks,
And
Dave.
so, and this is, I think, what the discussion of a campaign does, because you start thinking about things like, okay, what are the themes? If prevention, protection, affordability is the theme, well, what's the message? The message isn't that. The message is about the cost of electricity or the cost of food, or what just happened at the gas pumps because we're dependent on fossil fuels. We have to find messages that work, and not the same message works in every different setting. So we need people thinking about how to message in different contexts. So I think that, as Judy just said, I do, and uh, uh, so sorry, my mind just went on a name there. That Liz, sorry, Liz. I think that what Judy and Liz just said is the case. Affordability is the lynch. It's the linchpin. And I think that we can make those connections between affordability and the cost of energy, and energy that is actually creating more climate chaos. But I also think an important value that people have is protecting the people and the places and the things they love. And that is what is under threat. And I think we can also make some important connections there. And to Dave, wants us in, I don't know if I would use the word regiments. I mean, we talk about a youth climate corps. Maybe there's a senior climate corps. Maybe a corps is easier to take than regiments at a time of war. But the idea is activities. And there's an old kind of mantra that I always think about, and that is that activities attract and relationships retain. So for me, how do we build the activities that attract people to do things? Whether it's writing a letter, whether it's standing out in front of an MPP or an MP's office, whether it's holding a placard at an intersection, what are the activities that we can build that attract people? And then what are the relationships that retain them? And I think the relationships that retain them are organizations like CALL, organizations like SCAN, and organizations working together, because this is what we're building. We're building a community of activists.
And I think building on what everybody's been saying is that the idea of forming a team to uh, develop the strategy. So Dave talks about the brain trust. Well, the brain trust is, on the screen here. And it's on other screens and other organizations that are talking about these things. So I think what perhaps, since we're at the end of the meeting time, I think maybe perhaps what we can do is to get back to the people who attended this meeting, and then maybe David and I can sort of strategize around where we could possibly take this campaign forward and invite people into a more concrete conversation about a strategy and actions that we could mobilize around going forward. We might be able to form a sort of coalition of activists to try to strategize around a very concrete campaign using a lot of what has been talked about here at this meeting as a sort of framework and background for it. So I think if that's okay, David, you and I can sort of strategize around that and get back to people. The other thing is that I did email to all of the call supporters the March 27th events that SCAN has been engaged in developing. It's their community resilience and resistance campaign. So that's a campaign that they've been working on for this particular date. I had put some more links to that in the chat in case you didn't get those emails from us. But there are all kinds of things happening on the 27th, and there may be some in your community. But there's also letter writing. There's a sample call-in template to your MP. There's a leaflet you could post. And there's definitely a letter that you can sign to your MP. There's a senior specific letter as well as a regular letter. And there's some sample social media postings. All of that information was sent to you in an email from Call to all of our supporters to try to get people to engage in the March 27th campaign of SCAN. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for spending your time with us this morning. And thank you, David, very much for just a fabulous, thought-provoking presentation that gets us moving, gets us into action. That's what we need. Okay, folks, well, you'll
Thanks,
hear from me
folks.
later. Take it easy.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all.